Good afternoon, everyone. So first of all, my welcome also to all the participants who are joining us today for this very interesting session on integrating sustainability in the value chains. My first task is to introduce a very eminent panel which is here with us today. So let me take this opportunity. We have with us Mr. Sanjay Khare. He's Vice President, Safety and Sustainability Strategy, Skoda Auto Volkswagen India Private Limited. Mr. Sanjay brings with him almost 30 years of work experience, and he's mainly heading the sustainability function at Skoda Auto Volkswagen, and he's also looking at the integration of sustainability in the automotive value chain. Thank you, Mr. Khare, for joining. Mr. Jayant Roy, Managing Director, Lindstorm Service India Private Limited. Jayant brings with him 18 years of work experience in sales, marketing, business development, and general management in the service industry, as well as the consumer durable industry, and has experience of multiple geographies. We are also joined by Mr. Amitabh Bakshi. He is the Chief Procurement Officer, Tata Steel Limited, and he has wide experience of 32 years. In his last assignment, he was the Managing Director of Jamipol Tata Steel Promoted Joint Venture. Thank you, Mr. Bakshi, for joining today. We're also joined by Dr. Paul Davidson. He is Director UKRI for Smart Sustainable Plastic Packaging Challenge Program, and he's bringing with him 20 years of experience in the field of plastics. And Mr. Sandeep Singh, Managing Director from Accenture Sustainability Services. Thank you, Sandeep, for joining. Sandeep is bringing with him almost 16 years of work experience in assisting clients across the areas of ESG strategy, transition to net zero, and sustainable value chain. So a very eminent panel that we have here today with us. And so let me just begin by saying that the topic that we have for today, which is integration of sustainability in value chains, is definitely important. The entire momentum and traction that has been built around this topic has been there for many years now, but it has picked up the conversation, and the agenda is being pushed since COVID-19. And the reason is that there are a lot of vulnerabilities that were exposed during the pandemic. One, of course, is the vulnerability around the high dependence on the limited geographies. We witnessed that. And the biggest vulnerability that was exposed at India level was of the social fabric. And we came to know that how sensitive the social side is in the sensitive social fabric that we operate by the way of the mass migration that took place in India. And if we know that this mass migration included workforce that belonged to the informal workforce in India, mainly belonging to the supply chains of the companies. So those observations that we saw maybe 2 years back have woken us up, and that is why this whole momentum on the discussion on sustainability integration in supply chain has become very important. But other than this, there are a couple of other drivers also which are picking up the conversation. One, of course, is that there is a growing realization now that the sourcing geographies need to be diversified by the companies. And I think this realization, of course, came into picture after the pandemic. The other driver which is pushing this discussion is the increasing consumer voices, of course, the increasing conscious consumerism, as we call it, where the consumer is looking at the product and not just the product itself, but what the product is made of, something that is being looked by the consumer. Another area that is pushing this discussion is investors. So we had the investor session yesterday, we had the ESG session yesterday, and the same point was reiterated and emphasized that investors have started to look at not just the sustainability within the operations of the companies, but also in their value chains, mainly the supply chains. And last but not the least is the tightening of regulations across the globe. And when I say across the globe, it includes India as well, because we are well aware of how BRSR is evolving in India and how it is pushing companies not just to disclose their sustainability performance, but also to start taking action across the supply chains, because there are parameters around which the companies have to report. Having said that, our conversation today is definitely going to revolve around sustainability in value chains, but more what we want to hear from the panel is the experiences that they are bringing from their respective, companies. Because work in value chain is not easy. Easy said than done because it's a complex network that we are looking at. We are not looking at one company, we are looking at several companies in the room. And how do companies bring or break this kind of network to bring vendors, suppliers, retailers, logistics together integrate sustainability? Also, at CII, we have initiated our work formally on supply chain sustainability, and we call it as Eco Edge. This is something that we are launching for the Indian industry. The whole idea behind this is that we want to formalize a way of working with the Indian industry by looking at the areas of gaps within sustainability with the vendors of the company. So the whole objective is to build capacity of vendors around 4 pillars of sustainability, which is decarbonization, human rights, health and safety, and circular economy. And by the way of understanding those gaps, also build capacity of the vendors around this. So that is our initiative. More details of this can be found on our website. I'll not get into the details at this stage. You can access the brochure, which is available in the registration area. So let me move to my panel now. And I would like to open the discussion with Mr. Sanjay Khare. So it will be good to understand from you, considering that you're coming from the automobile sector. What is the perspective that you would like to bring on board from the automotive sector on integration of sustainability? And also, if you can take maybe a couple of minutes to help us understand the challenges that you face as an organization in the integration of sustainability.
Thank you, Swati. I think you have the context very, very beautifully. You covered most of the points. Absolutely, with the COVID, we realized how important the value chain is. Even today, the automotive industry, not making the finest product of Volkswagen, each one of us is really under the pressure of semiconductor supply chain globally. We will not be getting any of the cars in the markets for shelf because of simple reasons. They are waiting list back and enough 7 to 8 months. Second thing, what you rightly said, during the COVID time, we had a major migration challenge. We could not get people to come back and work in work plants and premises. And that's what happens with the major challenge that happens with any type of crisis which comes at. I think the whole debate of this climate change was, I think, it took up next dimension in 2015 after the Paris Climate Agreement, means the scientists declared that the world is going to get almost 40 degrees higher by the end of the century, and that will be really a catastrophe. And then after that, all the companies, all the governments started making big climate goals. So basically, some companies have made goals based on 2018 as a base or 2020 as a base, that by 2030 they will be able to cut their emissions. And by 2030 they will be making it to go to zero, literally go to zero. We also signed a big statement calling that we will go to zero by 2050. Across our entire value chain. We also signed to the science-based target initiatives. And as well as SBTi, we were I didn't go to 2 degrees centigrade once by 2050, but now we have changed to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And we are going to admit that. And if you see the entire automobile value chain, almost 2% part goes into the manufacturing part. But almost 50% will be work with our suppliers. Then the downstream value chain as well as the gross goes is almost 75%, and then just 5-6% goes into recycle auto vehicles. So we are working the entire life cycle phase, and this same initiative, Eco initiative, I'm joining along with Swati and CII team, and we are happy that we are working along with our suppliers as well as upstream as well as downstream dealers also on this topic. So now let's say that what are the methods that somebody should work on these topics. So obviously climate change is one, SDG 13 is one agenda which impacts each and every other SDG, whether it's water or health or education, everything will be one for a toss if the climate change temperature rises happens to much beyond to the desired levels. So in fact, there's only 7 to 8 years left to design that agenda to save the humanity or save our own future generations. In this next 7 to 8 years, what we can do at our own industry and at our value chains and design our products or innovations that will define the future for the world. So, I would say 4 specific pillars to work upon. In India, globally, the regulations are much more tighter. European Green Deal is driving the things in a much bigger way in Europe. And India also, we've got the BRSR norms. Uh, Fortunately or unfortunately, they are only for about 1,000 listed companies, and others are still open to public or not be done. But the regulations like for our industry, there's a capital norm. Or very quickly, there was a push from BS4 to BS6. So regulations and reporting, these are two things which are a mandatory thing which we cannot get away with. In fact, we are doing the voluntary reporting this year, though we are not a listed company, but we are doing voluntary reporting this year. Second area to really push the agenda is about doing that this is a big matter of efficiencies. If we do a sustainable process in our companies, in our organizations, whether at ourselves or at our value chain, economy and ecology are two sides of the same coin. For example, on my rooftop 5 years back, we could get a lot of salaries in the organization. We could do that mindset change and we shifted to renewable energy. We found that entire all our rooftops, huge rooftops were lying vacant. It's a 5 acre plant. We said that why not we give these places to somebody for investing the money over here, and we could find an investor and a company who could come and put the money in the rooftops and give the money, give the power to us, which was 60% cheaper. Instead of 8 to 20 paisa, I'm getting energy for 3 to 60 paisa unit. So it was all about building efficiency. We became a zero liquid discharge company. All our water is totally recycled and reused instead of plant for gardening purposes. We saved upon water costs. And after that, we started investing that some more money into CSR with water. We are now a water positive company. It's a big, huge automobile industry, which is a water positive company. We are also a certified water positive and certified zero waste organization. Zero waste means maybe 5, 6 years back, it was almost 1,000 tons that we were giving out as landfill, which has come down to less than 60, 70 tons right now. We are 99.3% zero waste certified organization, which is called platinum category. So, and again, I'm very sure that we will find some innovation to become absolute 100% also. So, these things have helped us to build efficiencies, and this is what the storyline which I'm going to my suppliers and my dealers, but you are going to save upon money. You are going to manage your working capital in a much better way. You are going to be much more efficient. And obviously, the reason sort of not very allowed to talk about is the building the resilience part. Now, very recently, just a couple of weeks back, I was in Europe. This war which is happening in between Russia and Ukraine, it's a war not just of anything else, but war of business. What the storyline going around is that on one hand, Russia is spending 100 billion euros in this war, and on the other side, they have jacked up the prices of their gas and energy, and they have made 150 billion euros already. For an industry who is working in Europe, in Czech Republic or Germany, which the energy cost is earlier, 50 euros per megawatt has gone up to 750 to 800 euros. Something like saying that the power which is available to us for 5 rupees a unit goes up to 80 rupees a unit. Just imagine what will happen. So if we have a resilience program, so now, I mean, when I was listening to Czech minister, I mean, I was in program and they were really pushing hard on how we can build a renewable energies over there. So this is a very agenda we can talk to our suppliers that how we can build up resilience. And last but not the least is that these products are not going to stay for a long time. Everybody has to invest money into innovations. And for innovations, into carbon capture and storage, or in the terms of battery technologies, we need money for that. And all this money will come to us from the investors only if they're very sure about ESG performance. That's all. I think I'll stop over here.
Thank you, Mr. Khare. I think that's a very interesting perspective from an automotive sector. I now move to Mr. Amitabh Bakshi. And sir, what I would like to understand from you is, considering that you are representing the procurement function here, and which plays a very major role in the whole point of integration of sustainability in the value chain, what is the perspective that you would like to bring in from the green procurement, and also including not just the green, because green is mainly talked from the environment point of view, but also the social lens. Sustainable procurement, your thoughts on that, sir?
Thank you, Shati. I think we are here to discuss a very important aspect. And one this panel is about cost to sustainability. I would like to focus on the upstream, which is what procurement process can do to contribute in this topic. And we see that if we really want to bring in sustainability or bring sustainability in the upstream value chain in any organization, we have to address the major stakeholder in the value chain, which is our supplier base. Alone, the organization cannot probably build sustainability in the value chain, unless the supplier base is also aligned with this particular process. And this is where I feel that supply management is a very important part of our work in this journey. And maybe the first and foremost that we would like to start with is to assess our supplier base, and with what is their preparedness, at what level are they in terms of the sustainability. And that assessment actually gives us a lot of insights as to where we are as an organization, where our supplier base is as as partners in this entire journey. So that's one important aspect of the fact that we want to get into this journey in the upstream value chain. Having said that, what is the next point of important step is to look at the entire issue in a very holistic manner. It's more of a transformation, in my opinion, to actually, bring in sustainability in the entire value chain of the company. And if we really want to, address this transformation, then we will have to address all the four P's: the people, the process, the policies, as well as the product. So when it comes to people, as we were discussing earlier, one very important part is to change the mindset of our people as well as our partners. That focus to sustainability, how important it is, and as Mr. Khare was mentioning, that how do we really build in economy with ecology? Because the general mindset is that if we, move into this, then probably we will increase our cost base, which will make our business, feasible, not feasible. The second is the process part of it, where it starts from the suppliers' processes as well as the organization's procurement processes. Like we were discussing a little while back, that it's important that the organization actually makes the procurement process available, approachable for the suppliers to actually get into this mode of building sustainability in their products as well as their services. I don't have to talk about products because that's an important aspect of it. How green is our product? How much are we able to reduce our carbon footprint? Producing the product at the supplier's factory and by using the product at the organization's end. Last but not the least is the policies, because these policies, whether it is at the government level, whether it is at the organization level, these are the policies which are going to actually support this entire journey of sustainability in the value chain. And resting at this point over here. Thanks, Swati.
Thank you, Mr. Bakshi. Let me now move to Mr. Jayant Roy. He's representing Lindstorm. Jayant, if you can just also briefly tell the audience what Lindstorm is into. Also, if you can help us understand your work areas which you talked about with respect to recycling and the rental model which Lindstorm has, and how that is contributing to the sustainability in value chains.
Yeah, thank you, Swati, and great insights from Sanjay and Amitav. Just taking from what they were talking about, that suppliers or the upstream, when you're looking at partnering with vendors, suppliers who should also understand the concept of sustainability. I think, I probably would be representing more from the partner side, where we are the service providers to various industry segments. And if you would have read, one of the biggest waste generators today is the garment industry. Uh, if you look at the hierarchy of waste that is generated, we always talk about, what can be prevented. But then the next factors that could be having the most important impact would be whether this could be, reused, recycled, or reduced. So how you could do these three parameters. And I think that's where, of course, we are based out of 24 countries worldwide. And, it's a Finnish organization that we've been here in India for the last 15 years. But then what we've also understood, or we've tried to partner big organizations, manufacturing setups, is that how we could look at contributing to various parts of this value chain. When we talk about reduce, typically what organizations do when they handle their workwear management in a layman's language, their entire uniform management that people would be wearing and going onto the shop floor, or manufacturing different application, wearing the uniform. So that's what we called workwear. And when you look at this, typically organizations would buy it, store it, and give it out to their employees to use, and then give it for washing somewhere. How we are looking at reducing this is we've got a production on demand facility where we try and only manufacture what is required. So thereby, the organizations don't need to stock up inventory in their warehouses. Similarly, then comes in the concept of reuse. So the same garments, today, which is given, or the workwear that is leased out to these organizations, are reused by people. So, they are designed in a way that they have longer shelf lives. If it does not get impacted by employee turnovers, because then these garments can be leased out to the next set of employees that are coming in. Of course, like Amitabh was mentioning, that mindset, because in India, typically people still feel that, okay, why am I wearing something that has been used earlier? And that mindset change becomes very important. So it is not only the vendors that need a mindset change, but also the organizations and their employees that would require that mindset change to kick in. And then how do you reuse these garments? And after that, how, when these garments have lived their life, are they recycled and then brought back into bio-based fibers or recycled fibers back into making garments again? So this is when we talk about the entire value chain. We are talking about making the 100% recycling of this waste, textile waste, which is one of the biggest wastes that we are producing across the universe, as well as how we are making our operations carbon neutral, for which we are also suppliers to, or the service providers to organizations, and we too have our own supplier base. So, the dichotomy is there both ways, that how do we not only help upstream, but also ensure that it comes in from the downstream.
Thank you, Jayant. Again, very interesting perspective. Let me move to, Sandeep. Sandeep is representing technology company and a very important enabler. Sandeep, technology has a very big role to play in making value chain sustainable. Your thoughts on how Accenture, your experience on that, how technology can play a major role, and any examples that you can quote from that?
Sure. I think first of all, we have heard some great points in terms of the need of the hour. Why exactly do we need to talk about sustainable supply chains, and exactly what it means in terms of driving behavioral shifts, driving partnerships, driving the use of technology? I'll probably just take a step back and put this entire conversation into perspective in terms of how critical is it in terms of the broader challenges that we are facing. And then let's say, think from the perspective of climate change, which is the most talked about challenge that the humanity faces today. So there is a piece of study which tells us that almost about 60% of global emissions actually come from supply chains. And it also goes on to tell us that 50% of the global emissions actually come from just about 8 supply chains, which includes things such as food, construction, electronics, automotives, fashion. Now that's one part of it. So quite clearly, given just the contribution that supply chains make towards the global emissions, it is critical for us to think about how do we decarbonize these supply chains to be able to win the challenge with respect to climate change. That's one. Now, second is that if it is as intuitive and as straightforward as that, why is it not already happening at scale? And that's where I think one has to start to think about exactly what is the nature of these emissions across the supply chains. Now, we all talk about things like one, scope two, scope three. I mean, just so that we are all on the same page, essentially, scope three emissions are the ones which happen not necessarily from your own operations, but something which happens either upstream parts of the value chain or downstream parts of the value chain. And there is evidence that almost about 11 and a half times emission actually happen outside the boundaries of an organization. So which is to say that if there is 1 ton of emission happening within the boundaries of an organization, there is an equivalent of about 11 and a half to 12 tons of emissions happening for that same emission, either upstream or downstream. So very clearly, it requires an organization to think about end-to-end approach. It requires them to think about not just within their boundaries, but thinking from all the way from the upstream parts of the value chain to all the way to the end of the consumption cycle, and then reinstating it back into the value chain. So that's the second part. Now, exactly what does it mean, and what are the implications or imperatives which emerge for the businesses? I think two things really stand out. One is that it has an implication in terms of the license to operate itself. We talked a little bit about all the new regulations, the EPI guidelines, the plastic waste management policies, the electronic waste policies, the BRSR guidelines. There is enough and more, and there is more to come yet. So quite clearly, there is more scrutiny, and organizations do need to get this right for them to be able to continue their operations. And secondly, and more interestingly, from a business perspective, there is evidence that it makes business sense. So we did a piece of research recently wherein we found that companies which are more ESG focused and who are trying to embed sustainability concepts across the supply chain, they actually outperform other companies with respect to both returns to shareholders as well as with respect to their operating margins. We found that there is almost 3.7x multiple in terms of the magnitude of the shareholder returns that they deliver, and almost 2.5 times operating margins that they deliver with respect to companies which are not embedding ESG principles in their supply chains. So very clearly, it's not a conversation around doing something because it is a good to do things, but it is something which makes business sense as well. Now, that brings me to my third consideration, and probably the most important one. Exactly how do companies go about thinking of really embracing sustainable supply chains? And that is where we as Accenture define a sustainable value chain or a sustainable supply chain across 3 dimensions. We talk about circularity, which is more about resource efficiency. How do you make sure the best use of resources? There is second life options available. There is recycling. There is refurbishment. So all of that kind of conversation, which is more about resource efficiency. There is a conversation around trust, which is a second component of a sustainable supply chain. Really thinking about adherence to human rights considerations, making sure that there is fair wages across the value chain, there is transparency, and there is traceability. And the third is really about net zero, which is probably the most talked about conversation, which is to say that how do you decarbonize your supply chains? Now, the last thought that I'll kind of make before I hand it over back to Swati is, how do you go about doing it? Because we're talking about an ecosystem which comprises of, let's say, thousands of suppliers, tier 1, tier 2, some of them not operating at the same scale at which a big MNC might be operating, much smaller in scale, kind of grappling with legacy systems which don't necessarily talk to your systems. We're talking about flow of materials, which probably is much more difficult to trace given the network of value chains which we are dealing with. We're talking about data systems which one has to deal with. If one has to get this right, that is where I believe, one, it cannot be done in isolation. There is a definite need for partnerships. You need to work with your suppliers, with your consumers, customers, and other stakeholders to get this right. And second, technology. This is probably something which requires a lot of learning, upskilling as well as some kind of investments to begin with. When we think about technology, it is also important to note that we are not just saying that technology is a magic bandwagon which will solve everything. Technology enabled innovation, because the kind of value that we are talking about is such scattered across the value chains that you have to think about innovative business models which can actually help you unearth and realize this value. So those are the 2 big things which I believe are important for us to be able to really transform to sustainable value chains.
Thank you, Sandeep. Let me move to Paul now. Paul, you bring in a lot of experience in plastics, and plastics plays a major role when we look at the supply chain, not just the upstream, but even the downstream side, from the packaging to logistics to various other things. What are your thoughts specifically from plastics point of view? Any experiences that you want to build here, that, what are the companies doing from the material aspect of plastics to reduce, recycle, replace it?
Sure. And thank you very much, and for the invitation to come and talk to you this afternoon. So I have a few reflections on this. And as part of the Smart Sustainable Plastics Packaging Challenge Fund, we're really focused on consumer packaging and how we can use that in a more sustainable way. But we quickly realized that the consumer, whilst the consumer is only one of the critical pieces to bring about the system change that we're talking about here. And that retail supply chain is vital if we're going to go and make this change. And the retail supply chain, I can only really talk about the UK context here, but I suspect it's pretty similar in India as well. But that retail supply chain is highly adapted, and it's been optimized to use plastics over the last 40 and 50 years. And any highly adapted, highly specialized system, whilst very efficient, tends to be very inflexible and finds making change really difficult. And so that's one of the things we bumped up to quite quickly, that the barriers through that inflexibility are pronounced. The other thing that we've been trying to do is work with those supply chains, particularly to introduce or reintroduce even reuse and refill systems into the supply chain. And again, what we found is that, because everyone talks about we have to have a compelling proposition for the consumer to switch, and that's absolutely true. But what we also need are compelling propositions for each actor in the supply chain to make the switch. Because if it doesn't work for either the brand owners or the retailers, you're going to struggle. And then I was build on that point to say is, particularly in consolidated markets such as retail, and the UK retail is very consolidated. We have probably 5 retailers have 80% market share. So in that sector, we have to understand where the power balance and the center of gravity within that supply chain. And so very often, for most of those supply chains, the retailer tends to be the center of power. So they can be really, really effective at driving change, or if they can't see the benefit for them, then they can also hinder it. So I'd say more generally, there's a real need to understand where's the center of balance in that supply chain and understand the motivations and the drivers of that piece of the supply chain. The final point on my opening remarks here was that we're trying to run trials to demonstrate how these reuse and refill models can work. And in the past, we've seen lots of these types of trials run, but they've been run at relatively small scale because they're expensive to do. And small scale tends to just mean to test consumer acceptance. What it doesn't show or test is how can those changes work right through the supply chain. So there is a need to invest and innovate on these changes, particularly if we're trying to bring about whole system change, on how those will be embedded through the supply chain. So how can the brand owners still retain that touch point and brand loyalty? How can the logistics companies continue to work and embed these new systems into their current systems and work as efficiently? And how can they be actually implemented on the shop floor by retailers? Because for sure, there will be a lot of operating changes that need to happen to operate refill systems, for example, alongside the incumbent systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Before I go to my next round of questions, I just want to check if audience have any questions at the moment, and we can take it right now. Anybody has any question from the panel? Okay. Okay, so we have a couple of hands up. So what I'll do is I'll move to my next set of questions a little later. Let me give a chance to the audience so that there can be a Q&A round right now itself. So why don't we go to the gentleman here at the center table. Please identify yourself and also please mention who your question is for, which panel member. Can we have the mic, please?
Hi, good afternoon. Myself Nitin from Dower India. I'm from sustainability background. So my question to Sanjay sir. So actually, in morning I had some BMW person is also coming, and you are also coming from automobile. Plant. In past, I am also a part of automobile sector. So in upcoming time, all person are looking for EV for electrical vehicle, and all automobile company looking for the electrical transformation. So, as per the current e-waste management and e-waste recycler in India, what we are doing at ground, we are dismantling the electronic part and reuse and resale to the another reason. Literally, the technically the metal recovery and other things are not going at ground. So, in upcoming time, if we are transforming to electrical vehicle, then lots of the electronic batteries waste will be generated. So, what is your future planning for handling the same? What you are doing for capacity, increasing the capacity building of e-waste management, e-waste recycler? At currently, same in plastic, government releasing lots of the regulation for recycling, for reuse content. But at present, the plastic industry capacity building is very low, very less infrastructure. So in same in electronic waste in EV, if we changing to electronic buses, electronic scooter, electronic cars, so maybe the same problem will be coming in future. So what is your view for increasing the capacity building for in term of e-waste?
I think for EVs shall talk, but for plastics, I think Paul can answer better on this topic. You're very, very right. Making any transition into industry, it's not easy job. It's not just about bringing it to the consumer. It's also about seeing the entire infrastructure, upstream and downstream both, whether the right charging infrastructure is there or not. Uh, because the biggest thing that happens to somebody's mind when he's using the EV, whether range is going to be there or likely or not the right word to use for this range anxiety. That is one topic where the customer gets little limited in buying the EV. So we are certainly working on one of the best technologies to get a vehicle charge up to 600 kilometers plus. Already we have launched a couple of vehicles in India, but obviously on the higher end, they are Porsches and Audis. And they do have a range of almost 450 kilometers and 500 kilometers. We have got some mid-range vehicles also operating right now on a trial basis, say Skoda Enyaq and Volkswagen ID bus vehicles in India also. We are on trials only. Europe, they are really selling very well. And you are very, very right. In Europe, it's a very, very matured system of vehicle recycling. Every city, every area at every 50 kilometer would be a recycling base available. And as far as India is concerned, though we have bought these vehicles in the initial stage, but we already made tie-ups with certain manufacturers, certain recyclers. I know a couple of them have done a really good job. There are, I know this guy in Atero. Atero is a company based out of Varanasi and started by a couple of IT Delhi people. And they are able to do the resource extraction to the last drop of lithium and cobalt and nickel. So that technology is available, and even they are thinking of how they can transfer this technology and have the centers opened up in Europe also. I'm not trying to advocate a company. There are other companies also like this. So all these companies, whether we or say BMW gentlemen that you are talking about and others, they already make tie-up with these recycling companies where we can give the old recycled batteries. And we certainly hope that we want to bring the EVs, the technology is there, but the entire infrastructure system has to mature. As far as our plastics are concerned, whatever plastics goes along with the car, we obviously have compliance to EPRs, wherever equivalent amount plastic gets recycled and reused, whatever way. But I'll give to Paul for the rest part, specifically on the plastics part.
So The first, and I think the overarching point, is that from a carbon perspective in cars, the largest emissions by far and away are the in-use phase. So anything that you can do to cut that should make the change. And so plastics being lightweight materials tend to reduce emissions of cars, and it's a definite step forward. So I would say the recycling of these materials should not hinder the transition to lighter weight solutions for cars, particularly as we're moving into the electric vehicle realm. The other thing I did want to point out actually with the recycling of plastics is that, as is rightly pointed out, that is mandated in Europe from the end-of-life vehicle directive, which actually focuses predominantly on the weight of the car and the amount of recycling you have to do per the weight. I think it's like 95% now. So the steel component is the most recycled, but there's certainly a lot of recycling on the polymeric content as well. That can be enhanced by material rationalization, and most of the car manufacturers have been and their supply chain has been very active in reducing the palette of polymers and compounds that are used in the car production to facilitate recycling, and so that's a very positive step forward. The remaining challenge, or one of the larger challenges that I think will become an increasing issue, is the consumption of tyres. Because obviously during their use phase, tyres wear, and we end up with a lot of tyre crumb being released in an uncontrolled way into the environment. I know per tyre, it's a few kilos per tyre, but globally, that's a lot of rubber that's getting out into the environment in a very finely divided form, which is one of the forms that we're quite concerned about. So both the tyres, that tyre crumb, and the additives releasing into the environment, and we don't really understand the implications of that yet. So I can see that becoming increasingly important agenda point as we move forward on sustainable transportation. Does that help the answer at all?
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Mr. Khare. Yes, can we have another question? I'll request if you can keep your question brief and mention who this is directed to.
Sure. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ankit and I'm from Bristlecone. So my question would be directed to Mr. Amitwa Bakshi. So you talked about, to achieve sustainability, we need to have the supply base also aligned, and also to start assessing the suppliers, right? So if I ask you, there are multiple metrics that we need to assess over here, but if I want to ask you, what are true one or two metrics that comes to your mind? And how is it that you are actually motivating your suppliers to be more sustainable? Is it like more of a carrot or a stick approach, or is it actually motivating them to follow sustainability? Thank you.
That's a great question. So as I was saying that, we need to address all the 4 P's. Okay. So here also, what is more important is to first address the supplier base, because they are our major stakeholder, or one of the biggest stakeholders in the upstream supply chain. And this is where we have signed up with Responsible Steel, which is a certifying body of certification of the World Steel Association. So they have their own criteria, okay, and it is based on both all the 3 pillars: environment, social, as well as governance. So criteria and the matrix of supplier assessment addresses all the 3 metrics, okay. And based on the assessment, we find out that, what are the gaps and what is the level of maturity they are in at this point of time. And then our supplier management team, picks up certain projects with them to actually work on the bridging the gaps that we find. Your second question about, how we motivate them. And that's also a great question. And that's where I was saying that we need to have processes designed to actually motivate your suppliers to bring in sustainability in their business models, both from their product perspective or their service perspective. And these processes will have to be designed in the organization to actually promote that. And that's where the green procurement comes in. That's where the green procurement policies come in the organization to actually bring sustainability in the entire upstream supply chain. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll come back to the audience, but I will just take this question to the other panel members also, and let me just turn it around a little bit. When we are looking at value chain, the supplier base, a very big question that comes into picture is suppliers asking, what's in it for me? Right? And suppliers are dealing with their own challenges, business challenges. So what are your, maybe just 1 or 2 points very briefly, if I can just run it with the panel, starting maybe with Paul and then coming to Jayant in the sequence. How do we deal as companies, how do we deal with this kind of a question?
Okay, can I answer that by giving you an example? So let's come back to that power balance we were talking about earlier on. So Tesco are the largest retailer in the UK. Their market share on their own is 33%. And this is where they really use that purchasing power to bring about change. So they produced a rag table, red, amber, green, for their plastic packaging. So they said, right, if it's on the green, you can continue to supply to us anything that's on this green list. So it's PET, high density, polyethylene. If it's on the amber list, get ready, we're going to phase you out. On the red list, you better stop supplying that. And on that red list, we're on a lot of materials that were already or continually being supplied, PVC and multi-layer films. And for a lot of time, people say, oh, we've got to have those. We need them for the barrier property. We need. And then suddenly when Tesco said, we're not having them anymore, thank you, then guess what? The innovation went like that. Market changed. And now, so if I look at multi-layer films in the UK, no one's specifying those anymore. And that was simply because of Tesco using its purchasing power and driving change through its supply chain through a very simple and very easy to understand initiative. And that table was remarkably effective at delivering change.
Jayant, your thoughts on the question, what's in it for me for the suppliers?
I think, what's very important is we have to understand that finally the suppliers or the partners are also a part of the family, right? And if the purpose of my organization is to care for the people and the planet, and how do I then take it to the suppliers or my partners there? It cannot be that, Paul was mentioning, it's quite simple to put the green and the red zone, but how do you help them come into or be in the green zone? And I think that's where the partnerships, the co-creation comes in. I think the hand-holding comes in. Like Sandeep was talking about that, if I can invest in technology, because I am probably a large manufacturing, company, but my suppliers are small MSMEs. How do I then encourage them? Then I probably have to start sharing out my resources that are available and start co-creating. So I think that becomes, if we do not work together and we start treating people that, okay, either you match my standards or you're out, I don't think that way it would work. So it cannot be a carrot and stick approach like we had earlier.
Thank you. Mr. Khare, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so very nice thoughts that they are our family, extended family, and we have to do hand-holding with them. We have to give them knowledge, impart knowledge where they don't have. And we have to also do the mindset change with them. However, at Volkswagen as a group for the last 10 years, we have got a S rating system in place. That's called sustainability rating, and each and every vendor, if he is registered with us, he has to do an annual assessment and give us the ratings. And if he only meets the basic minimum criteria of sustainability, then only he can work. And sustainability is about environment, the social, human rights, all the diversity and factors are considered into that. This is one of the specific factors. And now, obviously, next thing we are working along with the CII on this sustainable value chain initiative to motivate them on these topics. And obviously, it's going to be telling them what's in it for you. Like I just told you earlier, that it's about building the efficiencies or building the resilience part, which can help them for a better future. Thank you.
Thank you. Sandeep, your thoughts?
So I think we have heard a couple of perspectives on the upstream parts of the value chain. Let me build upon that and give you an example of the downstream part. So let's take a very simple example, that of PET bottles, the most often talked about example, and we have EPR guidelines and those kind of things which necessitate and require the organizations to bring back the PET bottles which have been used. Now, just think about exactly what's the whole dynamics looking like. There is a consumer who has used the bottle. This bottle, the PET bottle, used bottle, retails at a particular price point, and when it gets recycled, there is a different price point at which it retails. Now that delta is what the value is which the whole value chain has to realize. And if you do the math and if you use some numbers, I'll just come to the final number. It tells you that there is only about 2 cents which is available per used PET bottle, which can be realized across the value chain. Now that's too small, but it is still a value to be realized because the scale that we are talking about, the volumes that we are talking about is enormous. And even that 2 cents per bottle can actually magnify into much bigger value which can be distributed across the value chain. How do you realize it? The challenge there is that one has to really incentivize different parts of the value chain, different parts of the supply chain to be able to gather a share of that 2 cents per bottle. Only then it will make sense and only then it will actually happen in reality. Easier said than done because it doesn't necessarily happen. How do you incentivize the consumers to bring back those PET bottles? They hardly have any incentive in that. Now, that's where I'll give you an example of one of our clients who's actually working with a startup called Reward for Waste to be able to solve this problem. What they have done is that they have identified a scan code based technology which requires the consumer to just quickly scan the bottle before they dispose it off, and they can scan the smart bin in which they're disposing it off. And the moment they do that, there is some accrual of some incentives in the form of some redeemable points which they get, which is the incentive, which is some share of the 2 cents per bottle which goes to the consumer. I think that's the kind of innovation, that's the kind of co-creation that we were talking of, which can actually help you unlock this value. Maybe last 30 seconds, we were talking about electronic waste. I think there is about $1.5 billion worth of opportunity in India in terms of realizing the value from precious metals, gold, platinum, palladium, electronic waste. It is not yet getting captured. It is not yet getting realized. Why? Because 80% of e-waste in India is actually locked in warehouses. And there is no incentive for that part of the stakeholder ecosystem to bring it back to the parts of the value chain where it can be actually recycled and precious metals can be extracted. Again, the need for co-creation. Whoever is realizing that value has to understand that a chain is only as strong as the weakest link in it. So we have to incentivize that end part of the value chain back to the use of technologies.
Thank you, Sandeep. Let me come back to the audience here. Last set of maybe 2 questions that I can take up, one from you and one from the gentleman behind. Can we have the mic here? Please keep your questions brief.
Hello, my name is Virendra Turi. I come from Visar Asia. My question is with the perspective of the last large companies whose turnover is more than 1 lakh crores to 10 lakh crore in India. Now, looking at that net zero, the companies are going to transform totally with respect to their plant and machinery. And since I work with them, I also see that on annual basis, the kind of capex that they have to make is more than the profit that they make on annual basis. How do you see this happening for these companies? In terms of transforming them to net zero emission? That means they are, from oil to gas or from coal mines to they are going to, become energy companies someday by some ways and by some means. How do you see this happening? How do you see that money coming in, pumping that money, getting pumping? And then lot of challenges coming in terms of, skilling your manpower, changing, transitioning your manpower from blue collars to the white collars, and even looking at, the companies which are in the value chain who are a small player, they're also aligning their, technology part and making those investment into that. What are the kind of thought and the work that the
So you have asked too many questions in one question. I'll also take the last question from the gentleman behind, and then the panel can answer both the questions together.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Ranjit Sahu from Accenture. This question is to Mr. Bakshi, and specifically on account of Tata Steel, I've been closely associated with that account. So, sir, we are talking about supplier management, and it's a necessary evil. We cannot ignore that. Now, the point is that when Tata Steel at one end is looking for a very expansive, aggressive growth, like going to around 40 million ton over the next few years, now there will be a huge dependency on expanding the supplier base. Right? And, depending on the nature of the components and, different kind of technologies, equipment, etc. So there is a fragmented market. It's not about only the tier 1 suppliers, but it will be a lot of small players also getting pulled into your ecosystem, supplier ecosystem. Now, my perspective is that how do we ensure that at one end, looking at the aspects of responsible sourcing, right, and you're ensuring that the supplier database or the supplier base is compliant to the sustainability standards. At the same time, you have pressure of ensuring that I have an aggressive growth plan. I need to onboard the suppliers to get the material on time, right? So what's your view on that?
Okay, let me come back to my panel and, just request some of you to answer the question posed by the first gentleman and then so to you.
I'll not this is the question on climate financing part. That's a big question, and I think more of a geopolitical question. I'll come to the second question first. That you said that how will you build the capacities, or how will you change the the entire transition of new technologies will happen. So I'm very, very confident of the last 35 years of my career in this auto industry in India. I've seen many transitions happening. 1990s was a phase of quality. A lot of quality systems started coming in, and I think everybody got really very much engaged with those topics. And a lot of systems started coming into earlier largely manual process. It changed, number one. In the year 2000s, it was a time of robotization and automation. And a lot of mechanization, a lot of productivity improvement happens. TPM was a thing that was again gotten by CII also in a big way, TPM TQM processes. We saw that automation also happening. Earlier, there was a thought that how will people work with robots? And a lot of automation happened, and I think to this date, we are quite self-sufficient. In fact, during the last COVID times, we were installing new plants for our India 2.0, the 4 new cars. And we could do completely with help of our Indian suppliers because the foreign suppliers could not come and they could install and commission, do all the machinery parts. So that capability came. And the third phase is about what happens in 2010s. It was all about digitalization, how automation happened, how the new ERP systems came, everything started coming in. So I'm very, very confident about the Indians and capabilities. If they desire, it will happen. We already have things like Sundar Pichai and all the big wigs who are running the big corporations of the world. Why can't Indians do it over here? I'm very confident about their capabilities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I can speak for an hour, but I'll try to restrict it to a couple of minutes only. So yes, it is a very big challenge. It actually poses multiple challenges. When we want to grow at a pace at which we have planned for ourselves, we have to see how we can, develop our supplier base and that ecosystem at a similar pace. Having said that, it is not only about capacities. It is about all those challenges we talked about. Whether, how they will be sustainable, how much we can really address the social perspectives by being small suppliers in our business transactions, because there is a limit to which you can handle smaller size suppliers. So there is a challenge of consolidation also coming into the picture. So there are multiple such challenges over there. And that is what the supplier management team as of now is really working on to develop a roadmap to see how we can build in all these perspectives in our preparedness to support the growth plan that we have going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's already time for the wrap up. So I'll not get into Q&A more, but let me just wrap up the session by some 5 key takeaways that I have noted from each of the panel members and presenting it here to the participants also. The first point that I have noted is to identify the center of power in supply chain. I think once that has been identified, to drive the initiatives around sustainability or ESG becomes much easier because that leverage can be used to drive all the actions. The second is to build on policy systems and processes. Of course, once you have the policy, and a lot of companies have policies, but more important is the processes that need to be driven down to the value chain level in order to ensure that the policies get implemented. And of course, the people, which is the mindset that has been talked about, mindset change. The third point is assessment of suppliers. I think it's a very important area. Every supplier is different. They are either small enterprises, medium, big enterprises. To know your supplier base from sustainability point of view, understanding the material issues that each supplier has. So that assessment is another area to be looked at. The fourth is do small changes, as mentioned by Paul. Invest for solutions. before you even scale up. But then those solutions should be implemented right to the ground level to see what are the results that are coming out. And the final part is nothing is possible without partnership, collaboration, use of technology for innovation and co-creation. All of this has to be enabled together to make sure that we as ecosystem players are able to integrate sustainability in value chains. So with this, I thank my panel members for a very fruitful discussion and also my participants for very interesting questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Swati. I request all the speakers to please gather for the group photograph.